4-3. The above ground and the underground. When the above ground activist considers getting involved in the underground, an old saying applies: discretion is the greater part of valor. If you're not careful in whom you support and what activity you support, you may be taking far more risk than you should. Consider the case of Samuel Mudd, the physician who set the broken leg of John Wilkes Booth. There were very loose connections between Booth and Mudd, and little to no connections between Mudd and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And yet, in a frenzy to convict, a military court found Mudd guilty of aiding and conspiring in the murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, escaping the death penalty by one vote. Lori Fortier may have narrowly escaped a similar fate after the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995. After she helped Timothy McVeigh laminate a fake driver's license that he later used to secure the rental truck that carried a bomb on that fateful day. Any more involvement by Lori Fortier is based on conjecture at best. However, rather than see her railroaded through a kangaroo court and punished for something she had nothing to do with, her husband flipped and became a government stooge. He had not done so, she may have faced the same unreasonable guilt by association that Mudd had suffered. The hard and ugly lesson being, supporting underground activists can be extremely dangerous. Know who you support and get some kind of idea as to their activities. Otherwise, if they fail or botch their getaway, you may suffer for crimes you had nothing to do with. In the vast majority of situations, the above-ground activists should have no association with the activities of the underground, and at some time in the future, even knowing who they are will be extremely dangerous. The best course of action will always be to disassociate yourself from the underground in every way. Publicly disavow them, and publicly renounce them, and never allow yourself to have financial connections with them, as this will be an easy route the state will use to track down the underground and punish all involved. 4-3.1. The sabotage pincer and the above-ground pincer. Hackers and friend saboteurs should work to agitate the state by seeking out weaknesses in its security, transportation, manufacturing, and communication infrastructures, then exploiting those weaknesses, if possible, to cause systemic failure or at least confusion. At the point of systemic failure, the hackers and friend saboteurs' work is done, and the above ground becomes the point of agitation by consistently advertising the failures of central planning and forced compliance while trumpeting the advantages of spontaneous order and peaceful voluntarism. This is the essence of the dual pincers of the scorpion. This type of agitation causes the state to overreact, and because of the nature of the state, that overreaction is always some kind of violent authoritarianism. As has been stated over and over, when you only own a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, and with the state, that means every problem becomes an opportunity for the state to pound someone. This violent overreaction by authoritarians presents the second opportunity for the above-ground activists to point out the evil nature of government and again advertise the advantages of spontaneous order and peaceful voluntarism. Therefore, if done correctly, every successful action of the hackers and friend saboteurs pays off twice for the above ground in opportunities to bring shame on those who still support the state and in offering a moral solution. This is the metaphor behind the term Lego distribution network. The idea being that as soon as the state is asleep, we slip in and spread Legos on the carpet. Then, in the middle of the night, when the state gets up to go to the bathroom, he will step on them. Hopefully he will stumble and fall down the stairs, but even if he doesn't, we will know that we are bringing him pain and aggravation. The above ground and the underground can also work separately to reveal as much information as possible about specific state supporters of aggression. This can involve public revelations of the inner workings of the so-called shadow governments or double governments described by Michael Glennon and discussed later in this manual. These public revelations can include information about how double governments work, how politicians are actually powerless and are simply a show for the public, and how foreign and domestic policies are created to control the masses, not to keep them safe. In addition to this critical work, the above ground and the underground can also work separately to reveal private and personal information about key figures in the double government so that the stinger of the scorpion can have the sufficient information that it needs to facilitate the decision-making process when a stinging strike is required. The above ground and the underground can be the eyes of the stinger. Of course, the obvious warning has to be inserted here. Whenever the state reacts to the above described agitation, activists of all kinds should be as far out of the reach of the state as possible. This is why invisibility and security are so critical to all components of the underground networks, and it's why the above ground must have no direct ties to the underground. Consider the case of the journalist Barrett Brown, who boldly and bravely supported the hacker collective Anonymous while writing news releases about their exploits and helping to build a wiki to facilitate analysis of their hacktivism. Even though Barrett never did any hacking when the U.S. government and its crony cohorts at Stratfor suffered an embarrassing email leak in 2011, Barrett became a convenient whipping boy to be singled out and punished as an example for the rest of us. Journalists like Brown and others who have suffered even worse for their profession, such as Michael Hastings and Gary Webb, walk a narrow tightrope balancing between their drive to expose the truth and the tendency to become part of the story, all the while standing in the open, completely exposed to the slings and arrows of the state's fury. But for the rest of the above ground, the best defense against being punished for the actions of the underground is to have no discoverable connections to the underground, and of course, a consistent public history of denouncing them won't hurt your case either. 4-3.2 The Stinger: Natural Law, Defense, and Aggression. I'm intentionally being vague in this section of this manual in reference to ethics-based selective irregular warfare, as it is covered more completely and carefully in the section of this manual appropriately named Ethics-Based Selective Irregular Warfare. Among the reasons for being imprecise in this regard, in addition to the obvious reason of avoiding redundancies, is because at some point this manual may be physically divided into its three parts, and those who need to read this section will have no need of being associated with those who have a need to read that section. In other words, it may be important for some activists to physically possess a copy of this section of the manual that doesn't contain the other two sections. That said, by abandoning the trivium while embracing the Prussian education system, Western governments have systematically stymied the ability of many people to examine an ethical dilemma, break it down to its core questions, and develop a consistent logical solution. For that reason, a simple transitive equation such as the following can confuse some people. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then the equation A is greater than C can be assumed to be true without separate analysis. What one sees when interacting with many otherwise intelligent people is that they have, for example, adopted A is lesser than C as dogma for a variety of reasons and simply cannot re-examine their position despite the fact that they still agree that A is greater than B and B is greater than C. This is often the source of the problem we face when attempting to explain questions of ethics using grammar, logic, and rhetoric while contradicting tradition and authority. Many otherwise intelligent people simply cannot wrap their minds around concepts that are contradictive to what they have been taught. To put that statement in beer gut terminology, no matter what your mama, your teachers, or some Liberty great man told you, what I'm about to lay on you is truth, so grab your socks before you get clipped in the neck. There are always, throughout nature, waiting to be discovered on an as-needed basis. In and of themselves, they are neither good nor evil. Gravity, for example, is not good nor is it evil. It simply is. We wouldn't say that the man who falls to his death is a victim of evil gravity. That would be absurd. Yet, when we see something that seems to defy natural law, we quickly recognize that something is not quite right, and we tend to want to know why. We literally discover law through investigation and the resulting understanding of how things in nature work. This can be demonstrated by showing a simple sleight-of-hand magic trick to a human child or even some other animals. A well-known internet video shows an orangutan viewing a magic trick. The ape is both amazed and humored. The reason he shows such interest in the trick is because he knows something has happened that seems to defy what he understands to be natural law, and his curiosity drives him to fascination with the phenomenon. All animals have a certain built-in understanding of their role in nature and in the limits of nature. The same goes for the behavior of any animal. The lioness is not evil for providing her cubs with the flesh of a gazelle. She is simply following the law. Her behavior is required to preserve the lives of her offspring. If the gazelle had been able to escape the jaws of the lioness and the cubs had gone hungry, the gazelle would not be considered evil for starving the cubs. The lioness is following natural law, as is the gazelle when it seeks the opposite result of the encounter. In such an encounter, natural law is not contradictive, it is beautifully consistent, and a source of life and true peace. Evil, then, is what humans perceive when we see natural law violated in an unjust way by a human. Specifically, when one human unjustly uses violence or threats of violence on another human, we know that is wrong, the same way the orangutan knows something is not right about the magic trick. The difference being that at times humans choose to violate natural law through unjustified violence, and this is why self-defense must enter the equation to fully understand the relationship of natural law and peace. Since self-defense is a reaction to the breaking of natural law, not an original action in and of itself, it is exempt from law, and its execution is at the discretion of the person acting in self-defense. So, for example, if man A initiates violence on man B by punching man B in the nose, we may hope or expect man B to retaliate by punching man A back in return. However, we may not see justification for man B if he sprayed gasoline on man A and set him on fire. Most people would perceive the fire as an overreaction, but do we have the natural right to make that judgment? Did we feel the pain, the fear, the trauma? Have we lived man B's life? Do we know what it means to be man B and to be attacked by man A? This is the difference between natural law and civil behavior, and some have argued it is the basis of civil law. Natural law says that once man A initiated the confrontation, the judgment of what is just punishment is rightfully in the hands of man B and he alone. Only man B knows what it is like to be man B and suffer that specific assault by man A. Where civil behavior enters the equation is in the fact that the rest of us may or may not want to live around someone who would burn a man to death over a punch to the nose. So we rightfully may exclude man B from association, but there's nothing in natural law that would condemn man B for his chosen form of retaliation. In the last 5,000 years or so, judgments in civil behavior gave rise to agreements, and eventually they became codes of acceptable civic behavior. Eventually limits were placed on both self-defense and retaliation, and governments became the so-called authority of justice. In the case of Hammurabi's code, for example, retaliation was unnaturally enforced by government at the arbitrary line of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, bone for bone. And as all government programs tend to do, agreements in civil behavior became incredibly intrusive laws enforced at the point of a spear, controlling everything from contract law to sexual forbiddances to wage and price controls, and government began dictating punishments that depended upon the social ranking and wealth of the offender and the victim. All of this within the scope of Hammurabi's code. So what we see when we compare natural law with civil behavior is that natural law is never arbitrary, is fair, and always punishes us towards survival of our species, while civil behavior tends to be based on secondary observations by those who have no natural right to judge the matter, and tends to drift towards unfairness and intrusions based on social standing and wealth, where punishments are handed down from government officials. In other words, civil rules of behavior and second-party judgments must never supersede natural laws and primary party judgments, otherwise natural laws get replaced by government edicts, and even the original civil rules become null and void as tyranny replaces freedom and justice become a commodity to be purchased at a government-set price. This leads us to consider self-defense and possibly discover an aspect of natural law. Remember the aggressive man A and his violent attack on man B. It is possible that man B's overreaction to the punch in the nose could have been avoided had he spotted the threat man A presented and acted in preemptive self-defense. If man B had recognized man A's intent to punch, and once there was no doubt the event was imminent, If man B had struck first, would man B not have been more evenly tempered to judge the follow-through retaliation against his attacker, having not been subjected to the disorienting effects of the nose punch? In other words, perhaps if man B had acted in preemptive self-defense, there would be no need for the naysayers to wag their fingers in civil judgment of his actions, because he very likely never would have set man A on fire. In all likelihood, the event would have ended with man A being taught a quick lesson by way of a few bruises, and with man B avoiding humiliation, pain, and the judgment of his peers. Natural law drives the species towards survival, as both men come out better for the encounter. Thus, we see that preemptive violence can be an act of self-defense, and is consistent with natural law. If, on the other hand, man A simply can't learn this lesson, perhaps we are all better off without him in the gene pool. But that is not for us to judge, it is for his next victim to decide. This leads to our next step in discovering natural law in regards to self-defense. If you have knowledge that a man is stalking your child with the intent to harm her, you are following natural law when you interrupt that man's aggression before he harms your child. And if that man has a history of murdering innocent children, you are under no moral obligation to spare his life in the defense of your child before he has a chance to act. In a situation such as this, preemptive defense is not only wise, but within the natural law definition of ethical action. Many adherents to the zero aggression principle attempt to argue that we may not defend ourselves until after the physical aggression has been initiated by the attacker. This is illogical for several reasons, the first of which is that true defense, by its nature, involves the presentation to the potential attacker the prospect that an attack will have a price, so that the attacker can choose to avoid the confrontation to begin with. Otherwise, we could be considered baiting the attacker if the attacker has the impression that he may have the first strike free. Remember, almost every dangerous or poisonous animal in nature has clear markings to warn its attacker. After all, in many situations, the attacker who has his first shot free often leaves the victim incapable of self-defense after the first strike. For example, I'm about 6 feet tall and weigh around 240 pounds. Additionally, I have trained in personal combat, including the European martial art of pugilism. If I or someone of comparable size and skill were to get a totally free bare-knuckle fist punch in a fight, the fight would likely be instantly over, no matter the size, strength, or training of the victim. That is clearly not a natural law situation that advances our species or promotes peace. So then, natural law provides for preemptive self-defense while remaining within the constraints of the zero aggression principle. Now consider the following. According to the FBI in 2014, burglary losses in the U.S. topped out at $3.5 billion. In that same year, according to the Institute for Justice, U.S. law enforcement stole $4.5 billion using asset forfeiture laws. Don't be confused by such a huge number by thinking that massive amounts of money was taken from big-time drug dealers, because that didn't happen. The median forfeiture amount in 2014 was less than $500. Now ask yourself how you would treat a known burglar. If half of all burglars wore distinctive uniforms with a clearly displayed badge indicating they are a burglar, how would you treat them? Would they be safe walking down your street? Would they be safe sitting in a clearly marked car in your neighborhood? Now consider that there were roughly 20,000 no-knock raids in the U.S. in 2014, and that number is rising every year. The largest crime gang in the world already wear uniforms, carry military-grade weapons, and steal more from peaceful people than all of their competitors combined, and that doesn't count what is stolen in taxes and through inflation. The above being the case, if we have clearly demonstrated that a specific institution is based on intimidation, violence, and theft, and if we have demonstrated that specific employees or representatives of that institution have a proven record of using intimidation, violence, and theft to advance that institution and themselves, and if we have demonstrated that said representatives of said institution are both willing, capable, and at some point in the future likely to repeat such aggressions upon ourselves, our loved ones, or other equally innocent victims, then we are not under obligation to wait until that specific aggressor strikes the first blow against us and our families. And if both the institution and the representative of that institution are known to kill the innocent, we have no obligation to limit our use of force when defending ourselves and family from that aggressor. Actually, much like the lioness above, it is our natural responsibility to preserve our family and remove threats before they can do harm. And like the law of gravity, the natural law of defense cannot be logically described as evil. It simply is. Back to beer gut terminology. They are in our towns, they are in our neighborhoods, and they are daily entering our homes and having their way with our property and our loved ones. They don't think we can or will do a thing about it, but they are wrong. We can and will stop them, but we must do it wisely. We cannot foolishly play into their hands through open confrontation.